This mistake nearly cost me a $20,000 film job. As filmmakers and cinematographers, at some point throughout our career, we've all no doubt encountered a situation that could have completely ruined a shoot for us and lost us an important client. It's unfortunately one of those things you likely have to experience and overcome to learn from. But trust me, don't do that. Learn from my mistake right now. Hey guys, welcome back. My name's Tom Park and I'm an underwater and wildlife cinematographer. Throughout this series, we're discussing the world of filmmaking and cinematography, where I'll teach you some of the things that I've learned over the last decade working in the film industry as an underwater and wildlife cinematographer. If you're interested in this sort of thing, subscribe and let me know down below what you film and if you've ever learned a critical lesson by overcoming a near miss. So this is a pretty big mistake that I made almost 5 years ago, and was something that nearly cost me at the time what was a pretty large and important job. I've had to learn this lesson the hard way, and I'm sharing it so that you don't have to do the same. The story starts a number of years ago on a job where I was the director of photography, and it was just me traveling with the client who was directing the film. It was during the beginning of the pandemic, so we had to keep our team down to a skeleton crew. We were out on the outer coral sea documenting coral reefs following a bleaching event for a documentary film, and we had lined up a private charter and had everything we needed to capture our shots. As it was pandemic times, we didn't leave much to chance, and we both got to the film location on the Great Barrier Reef a few days in advance, just to ensure that all of our gear and everything arrived on time. As we had about 3 days to spare, we ended up jumping on another boat and heading out to the Great Barrier Reef on a standard customer trip, just to capture a few extra shots and check that we had everything in order for our film. We had some pretty technical scientific equipment and 3D techniques that we wanted to test out and ensure that everything was in order ahead of our expedition. Anyways, the gear that I brought with me to that date was what I'd used on all of my films. It was equipment that I was super comfortable with and had had a lot of experience using, which at the time was 2 camera bodies, a range of lenses, underwater lights and some spare underwater lights, an underwater housing, a couple of drones, and a gimbal or 2. A good 2 Pelican cases worth of kit. Especially when it comes to underwater housings, I've never been one to use cheap equipment and have always purchased high-end aluminium housings, as there's nothing I'd hate more than to have my camera flood on a shoot. But on our first dive, on this pre-shoot test dive, something I'd never thought possible before happened. My underwater camera started leaking from the front of my dome. Not from my O-rings and not from any of the seals that I can maintain, but from the front gap between the glass of the dome and the aluminium. What had happened was that the silicone that was actually holding the glass in place had somehow worn thin and had created a gap large enough for water to enter the housing. Obviously, we cancelled the dive, and when we got back on board, the slightest knock on the front of my dome released the glass from the dome entirely, leaving me with an 8-inch hole in the front of my camera. My worst fears had been realized. I was with the director on an important shoot after spending thousands of dollars on travel on private charters, months in planning and mapping the coral bleaching, and we'd finally made it to the reef ready to film. And my supposedly high-end underwater camera housing had a gaping 8-inch hole in it. It was not a good look, and the director was understandably not impressed. No matter how many times I said that this housing is one of the top underwater housings available on the market, and that I insure all my equipment and take great care of it, and that this was absolutely not something that I could have predicted, all the client saw was that her director of photography had a camera that didn't work. It's one of the worst situations a DP can find themselves in, and in hindsight, this was an event that I was unprepared for. So there we were, stuck out at sea with no reception, no one to help us, the clock ticking, and we had no camera to film with. Luckily, this was a test shoot, but the real shoot was only 2.5 days away, and we had to spend the next 2 days at sea without reception, which severely limited our ability to troubleshoot. Without too many better ideas, I tried something insane. I got some Selleys roof and gutter silicone grease that they had lying around the boat, and it was used on things like the bathroom mirrors and stuff like that to hold them in place, and I applied a layer of that around the outside of my dome in an attempt to reseal the glass element of the dome back to the camera. And believe it or not, it worked. For 1.5 dives, where obviously it started leaking again and we were back to square one. After another day sitting with the director in disbelief, we eventually got back to reception, and the first thing I did was call my insurance company, who pretty much confirmed that there was nothing they can do about the situation we're in, but the camera was covered. No help at all. So we began calling everyone we knew in the area who had an underwater film camera that was possibly up to the spec we required, to see if we could rent out their system for a few days, which of course inevitably failed, as with only 12 hours notice, there was no way we could make it work. And while we had a range of connections in Sydney to rent from, it would take a few days for the camera to get up to the reef. Having exhausted almost all of our options and with only hours to go until the shoot date, it became inevitable that we were going to have to postpone the shoot, as we just didn't have a working camera. The director and I spent all afternoon, mind you this was the afternoon before our private charter left first thing in the morning, calling and visiting every single camera store in the region, looking for replacement domes that were compatible or for parts that could fix our problem and get my camera working. Of course, on such short notice, these last-ditch efforts almost never work out. In our final hours, way after the close of business time, we did manage to find an underwater camera retailer who was surprisingly still at work, and believed that he could jerry-rig one of his non-compatible dome ports onto my housing, and somehow make it work. Luckily, he was correct, and his system worked, and we could get the job done. But this situation caused days of stress for both myself and the director, as we genuinely were preparing to cancel the shoot or postpone it, costing us both reputation and thousands of dollars in losses. This is a situation you should never find yourself in. Not being prepared and not having a spare underwater housing almost cost me one of the biggest clients and jobs of my year. The lesson here is no matter what you shoot is to always have a spare. I was under the impression that as underwater housings cost up around $8,000, that there was no way I should be expected to bring a spare. And that assumption nearly cost me far more financially and reputationally. It's not a risk worth taking. If a piece of your kit is that critical to the job, bring a spare and always have a backup available. This is something I implemented literally the next day after getting home from the shoot. I already had spare camera bodies, lenses, drones, gimbals, underwater lights, but I didn't have a spare underwater housing. So I ordered one in addition to replacing the one that failed. For my Sony kit now, I have both an ISOTA underwater housing, which in my mind are one of the best housings available on the market, and I also have a backup Sea Frogs housing. This backup housing is not something that I would like to rely on full time, but I have done a bunch of testing with it and the housing seems to function well enough as a backup option. I know plenty of hobbyists who use this housing and seem to have no issues with it. And for only $1,000, it's an extremely cheap backup option that will get the job done if my primary ISOTA system fails. I've never had to use it, and I hope that I never will, but it still comes with me on every single shoot that I use my Sony rig for. For my Red kit, I obviously don't have two $30,000 underwater housings, but for jobs that use the Red, I will always travel with my 4K Sony system as well. This kit, while it is not a Red, is still up to IMAX and Netflix specs and can definitely get the job done in the extremely unlikely event and heartbreaking event that there's an issue with my Red. For important projects, always have a spare with you, as there is nothing worse than being on location with the director and crew with a camera that doesn't work. It's not worth the risk, and at the end of the day, it is your fault and responsibility, just as it was mine. I hope you learned from my mistake, and if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more, and I will catch you in the next one.